You're locked on to the SABC News channel. Thank you for joining us this Sunday afternoon. Well, motorists will have to dig deeper on Wednesday, with petrol set to cost R1.34 more a litre. In other news, with unemployment rife, we take a look at yet another jobs for sale scam, this time at the embattled parastatal Transnet. And from the sports scene, Kaizer Chiefs and Cape Town City do battle for the last semi-final berth in the Nedbank Cup Challenge. Well, in a developing story this week, the attacks on foreign nationals in Durban have again thrown sharp focus on what some are calling xenophobic sentiments or attitudes that still prevail in many communities, and the challenges around successful integration of immigrants into South African society. To discuss the psychology behind xenophobia and all the criminality attached to such acts is counselling psychologist Jeremy Beyer. Good afternoon, Jeremy, and thank you once again for sharing your time with us on the SABC News Desk. Jeremy, some distressing images coming out of Durban this week, and we're seeing this kind of destructive othering coming forth. What motivates behaviour like this in the first place? Well,
listen, there's no doubt that unemployment and the economy is a big factor, but those are factors. The question is what triggers hostility, so multiple factors. The fact that this culture of othering hasn't really been dealt with and is still embedded in our society, still 25 years since democracy. These cultures not seeing, these people not seeing justice and not seeing change, therefore fueling that fire. Current political rhetoric, which without a doubt is divisive, which the mentality is, if you want to blame someone, blame that group. So you keep hearing that from political leaders. And then, of course, most of all, a society that is quite silent when it comes to human rights violations. And a society that only rarely speaks when there's an absolute disaster, like an Esidimeni or Karabum or Kwena or that type of thing. So those are the kind of things that fuel the fire. And then when people are that desperate, people will take the law into their own hands. You've got the risk of vigilantism.
I want to talk about the day-to-day stresses, because one gets a sense that these communities have reached a tipping point. So how would these frustrations manifest? Would one present with physical symptoms like anxiety or high blood pressure? Or how does it work?
So firstly, persistent irritability and aggressive outbursts, whether it's to your family, whether it's to friends. Then substance abuse, without a doubt. When you're frustrated, that kind of thing, people self-medicate, especially with obviously alcohol and drugs. So of course, when you're under the influence, your inhibitions are, I guess, loosened, if that's the correct word, and that increases the chance of hostility because there's no thought process before you do something. So that becomes more common. And then, of course, when a lot of people are in the same boat, you think, well, I'm not just the only one who's going to be spotted. We're all in the same boat. Let's group together. Then you have that sort of...
Because that just preempts my next question, because how does this then relate to crowd behaviour? And we see things like looting and criminality coming forth.
So when there's crowd behaviour, you usually have... It's not everyone. You usually have a few people who start it. So when a few people start it, almost subconsciously gives license to other people to follow on. And then also what starts it is that they're all in the same boat, they all have the same mentality and are all frustrated and are all scared as well. So when you have a few people who trigger it, that gives other license to other people who feel they're in the same boat, and then you have a case of light the blue touch paper and then hostility.
All right, if we internationalize this a little bit and then we think about the Christchurch terror attacks on the mosques and places of worship for Muslims, these acts reflect a deep-seated hatred towards ordinary people based on religious affiliation or race at that even.
Religious and race, yes, but often fueled by someone, fueled on social media. Social media is a big factor in this. Fueled by political leaders. For me, Donald Trump's a big factor in this whole thing, and it's this kind of right-wing nationalism is being spread around the world. Extremism. And so because you have Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, that can spread it. So that fuels it. So the moment that happens, you've got this problem. So yes, it is rising. It is all around the world. It's not just in South Africa. And yes, I say, and yes, unemployment is a factor. But when there is no active citizenry in your country, when you have a silent society, that is a recipe for disaster. And that is a big concern for me at the moment, is we don't speak out. We don't look at things from a human right lens. Generally, we're quiet, except on odd occasions.
All right. I want to talk about these sweeping blanket generalizations made by high-profile political leaders and such. Donald Trump here at home as well locally, where we want to associate all foreign nationals with criminality, which is just not an accurate portrayal of what's happening on the ground. What is the impact of this on the public consciousness?
Well, the impact is huge. Firstly, it creates that other mentality. Secondly, it fuels paranoia. So you keep hearing about these bad people and fuels the paranoia, and now the moment they come in, that paranoia fuels hostility, because eventually something's going to give. So the more it gets said, it becomes almost like propaganda that you see in newspapers, like what the Nazis did in the early 1930s. It's basically propaganda, whether you do it in the news, in the newspaper, etc. And the more that builds, the more it gets embedded into someone's mindset, and the more they start to believe it. That's the power of the media and hateful, divisive rhetoric. And I'm afraid to say, and this might be a controversial statement, but Donald Trump's got blood in his hands when it comes to issues like Christchurch, because that is hateful rhetoric which spreads very quickly.
All right, Jeremy, I want to bring it back home for a moment. In the aftermath of the 2008 violence, we saw a three-pronged approach. There was we had to prevent the violence, then humanitarian aid, and then it was based on an agreement with communities in the areas, in the affected areas. But this hasn't worked so well. What are some of the crucial elements that one would have to take into account for successful integration?
So again, firstly, more active citizenry, whether it's NGO groups, government, all of those groups to work together. So police, NGOs, government and civil society work together to fix these situations. Right now there's a silo mentality. That's the first thing. Secondly, without doubt, inequality breeds attacks. Because there's people in those societies who don't get help, where there are less resources in those societies, there's less help in those areas. So inequality, without a doubt, fuels attacks. And then thirdly, the language, like I said, from political speakers has to change from divisive to unifying, like Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, like that type of language, and just to promote a culture of human rights and civil society looking at things from a human rights lens, as opposed to a situation where we go from denial to despair and then flat panic and paranoia.
One needs to know, how do we ensure that these differences don't become the basis for discrimination and hostilities? Because we want to encourage migrants not to give up their identities, but rather enrich the diversity we already have.
So in many ways, firstly, from the home. So parents to their children. What are you being taught at home, and what are you being taught in school? So from a young age, being the way you're being taught in school.
So the way you're being socialized,
the way
in
you're
the
being
home
socialized, 100% the way you're being socialized. Then people not seeing injustice in their society, and political people saying what they want. Because the mentality is, well, if adults can say it, why can't I do this? So the role modeling has to change, because quite frankly, the role modeling now is pretty poor. That has to change. And then without a doubt, in people's society, seeing change in terms of resources, in terms of jobs, in terms of just seeing change, because in 25 years in many places there hasn't that. So people are not seeing justice. And then when that happens, people take the law into their own hands.
You mentioned the workplace. Because these kind of sentiments don't only stay in our communities, they filter through to our schools, to our workplaces as well. How should we best be handling diversity management and social cohesion in the workplace, Joe?
Well, in terms of the workplace, it comes from leadership firstly. Persistent communication, regular discussions, the way you handle conflict. When you handle conflict, not attacking the person, but attacking the problem, and not making it personal, as opposed to leaders who are divisive, or where there's only criticism and no praise for accomplishments. So that should be, and generally fostering a culture of talking and communication in your work environment. Coming from the home, of course, from a young age, in terms of our education system, without a doubt. And lastly, when we educate our children, when your child reads something, the child mustn't just consider what the reader thinks, consider what you think. In other words, foster a culture of critical thinking, where you learn to think for yourself. That is what education is about for me, is learning to think for yourself. But I'm concerned about that with our education, where it's just about how to remember things. If we develop a more critical society where we can learn to think for ourselves, then we can act quicker. But right now, it's a reactive society.
Jeremy, thank you so much for your time on the SABC News Desk. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. That's our counselling psychologist, Jeremy Bayer, joining us on the SABC News.